and we could store as a private data member of that object the DBH handle. So we instantiate it and store it inside the object. But because we have no objects, because we're adhering to the singleton model right now, we have to store it inside of, secretly, the method itself. So back to the courses class. This is what we used that connection for. And then back to the test routine, that's all it did. So any questions on this approach, which is actually pretty clean. It's sort of a nice beginning of an API for accessing course data via a PHP code, as opposed to having to care about SQL queries yourself. Right? This is code I could write and then say to my partner, here's some code you can call if you want to access courses. So it's very similar in spirit to the sort of model code you need to write, or you've had to write for Project Zero. All right, so let's improve this. In version 1, and there's only 4 versions today, not 11, let's go into courses again. And notice that this time the method looks a little different. So instead of calling fetch and saying give me an associative array, what am I apparently saying to PDO instead to give me? Yeah, so apparently I've changed fetch to fetch object, which does what it says. So it fetches an object. It apparently takes an argument. And this just tells PDO, what object do you want me to hand you back? So we talked about constructors briefly earlier, and some of you might already have that experience. What fetch objects will do is it will automatically call new course, and then it will fill that object with public properties corresponding to what came from the database. So instead of getting an associative array, you instead get an object. But unlike CodeIgniter, which hands you a generic object, you instead get a course object, which is going to have some value to us in just a moment. So now this time I'm still returning an array, but it's an array of course objects. So who cares? What does this allow us to do? Well, now what I can do is introduce one more file. So we did not have a course.php file a moment ago. So now we can actually model this real-world entity. I didn't put much effort into it, but we do now have a more semantically properly named container than just a generic associative array. Now, not compelling, right? This is meant to just be a stepping stone. Because what can we now do with this? Well, if I go into my test routine, I can now at least treat this course in a loop as though it's an object. Again, could just be generic, but at least I'm taking a step toward making a course object. So what is this going to do? The output's going to be similar in spirit, PHP test, but first let me open the database and change project 0 to lecture 3. I'm going to run PHP of test.php. This too, if unfamiliar, if you need to write little test scripts, you don't need the shebang. You can actually say call PHP, interpret this file, enter. So now I see all the titles from several thousand courses. So let's do one better than this now. Let me go into version 2 and look at now the course class. So now I'm being a little more proper, and I'm also implementing that paradigm of, insert buzzword here, so lazy loading. Right? So now I've decided that, you know what, having a course class with nothing in it is pretty useless. Right? I might as well just use the associative arrays and not waste my time pretending to be writing better code. But what if the goal of this class is to provide with the course entity related functionality? And that functionality might be get me the instructors, which is not a feature we supported a moment ago. So if I want to now say that there's a method associated with a course object, notice how I can implement this. So 1, I have an empty instructors array. 2, I get my database instance. And now this is more compelling. Now I'm talking to the database from multiple classes, so it's a little more compelling that I use this singleton approach. Now I prepare a statement, select star from instructors where, and what's going on here? Well, if unfamiliar, you don't need to join all the time to get to reunite multiple tables. If you want to select data from one table based on values in a second, join is not necessarily the solution. And in fact, it might give you back way more data than you care about. So this means get me all the instructors whose faculty ID is in the result of this nested query. So here I'm saying select instructor ID. The name doesn't have to be identical, but the number of things outside and inside the parens needs to be the same. Select instructor ID from course instructors where catalog number equals catalog number. So the nested query gets me all of the faculty who teach that course, but I don't just want their ID. I want actually their name and their first name and their last name. So my outer query ensures that I actually get back the data I care about. So now I execute this. I call fetch object. This time I want back an instructor object. I store the instructor in the array and return that array. All right. So either this is really confusing or just really boring. So let me try to spice it up. by showing you what you can now do with this little test file. So here's where now the fact that we've introduced this additional model for course individually, for an individual course, starts to get more useful. So now I can still call get courses as I did before. I can now still iterate over each course as I did before. I can still print each course's title as I did before. But now notice I can iterate over each course's instructors and then access its name, which suggests that inside of the instructor class is a name method. Why do I have a name method? Why not just output the name with the arrow notation with no method call? Think back to Project Zero and the data you've actually been using. Why? This is actually another good motivation for introducing a wrapper class called instructor rather than just rely on public properties. Yeah?
There's two reasons. One is that you don't want it to be mutable.
Okay.
And the other one would be that sometimes it's like null.
Okay.
You don't want to say like no. You want to have the wrapper say, oh, there's no name, say name to be determined.
Oh, those are actually two great ones. So just for the camera, so one, we have, if it's null, you want to make sure that maybe we want to spit out unknown professor or something like that rather than just the empty string. And then in the first case, we want to make sure that you can't change the person's name, right? Their name is their name from the database. You don't want to accidentally mutate that property by just using the simple arrow notation and the property name, so the method protects that information. And then, yeah?
Well, the particular data set we're using doesn't have a single field for name.
Perfect. Right, so there's like the prefix field, the suffix field for junior, senior, and all of that. There's the first name field, the last name field, the middle name field. My God, there's like 5 things. And your code would look atrocious if you, the end user, had to concatenate together all 5 of these fields. What better opportunity to have this layer of abstraction where you call the name method and it does that reassembly for you based on what fields were actually in the database. So if I go into my instructor class, notice this is the additional file I just introduced, and I go into instructor, that's exactly what I'm doing. I actually cut some corners, as you might have seen quickly in PHP-MyAdmin. I didn't bother with prefix and suffix, but just having 2 fields is still compelling. Now, there is one gotcha here aesthetically. If someone's missing a first name or last name, I'm going to return a sort of ugly formatted string, so I should probably clean that up. But this is what's so nice now about object-oriented programming in general. If my partner yells at me a week later and says, hey, there's some guy with a missing first name, and so you're returning a space and then his last name, I can go back and clean this up without my partner's code having to change at all. So you agree again on this contract of methods and properties. So there's one thing still wrong here. If I look again in my courses methods, notice that I'm just using fetch object. I'm instantiating a course object, and then again PDO is just filling that object's fields for me. Specifically, what is the fetch object doing? It's literally doing something like this. It's saying something like object gets new course, and then PDO is doing this for me. Gets row, let's say this is course, so let's say catnum. Whoops. Oh, catnum. And then it's doing this. So all the fetch object method is doing for me is it's not doing anything fancy with constructors or with object-oriented programming, really. It's just doing that, and then what it's returning to me is this. So it's saving me that trouble, and that has value. This is kind of clean that it deals with this for me, but what's the implication for catnum and title if I am creating objects using PDO in this way in terms of visibility of those properties? They're public. Right? And that was not the best decision we decided earlier. So on the one hand, oh, so clean and easy. I call one method. I get back the class I want, the object I want. It's not the best design. So can we do a little better? Well, let's go in here and see in version 3 in courses. Notice that I'm doing this, fetch object course. All right, so let's see here. Let me go into course this time. Oops, that's in there. Let's see. For instructor. So we won't bother with course. I just did it with instructor because it would be redundant to do them in both. Now notice I went into the instructors method, which previously just had a name, instructors class, which previously just had a name method. And I've explicitly said, you know what? This class is going to have a private ID, private first, private last variable. My partner can see this if he wants to look at my code, but this means nothing to him or her. In fact, he or she cannot access any of these private data members if they're using my objects. But notice what I can still do. If I now have an explicit constructor that takes 3 arguments, we can do what we said we could do earlier. We construct an instructor object, we assign those 3 values privately, and then if you want to access the name, well, you still use this public method. So notice we've commingled 2 public methods with 3 private properties. And as an aside, methods can also be private if you need to write something yourself, but you don't want your partner or someone else to be able to access it. So if we now go into the course class, notice that down here, I am doing this a little more properly. I'm getting from my course instructors table and my instructors table a whole bunch of rows again and again and again, and I'm going back to the regressing a bit to the associative array approach. So